Good afternoon, and welcome to today's book talk about The Last Ghetto. My name is Gabriel Sanders, and I'm the public programs producer at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. Now in its 25th year, the museum is committed to the crucial mission of educating our diverse community about Jewish life and heritage before, during, and after the Holocaust. As part of that mission, our programs illuminate the stories of survivors, broader histories of hate and anti-Semitism, stories of resistance against injustice, and more. Thank you for joining us today virtually. We hope you will visit the museum in person to see our new core exhibition, The Holocaust, What Hate Can Do, alongside our temporary exhibitions, Boris Lurie, Nothing to Do But to Try, which is running just through November 6th, so limited time to see it, and Survivors, Faces of Life After the Holocaust, photographs by Martin Scholler, which just opened. That'll run through June 18th. Learn more and find tickets on our website. We appreciate the vital support of our members so much here at the museum. If you want to get closer to the museum and enjoy exclusive programs, member previews to exhibitions, and free admission, you can explore museum membership on our website or email membership@mjhnyc.org to learn more. Closed captions are available on today's program. Instructions on how to turn captions on or off will be posted in the chat, in addition to the links I've mentioned. If you have questions for our speaker during the program, please put them in the Zoom Q&A box, and we will get to as many as we can at the end of the hour. Today, we are honored to be joined by Anna Hájková and Benjamin Carter-Het. Dr. Anna Hájková is Associate Professor of Modern European Continental History at the University of Warwick. In addition to her academic work, Dr. Hájková is a queer history activist and public intellectual. Her first book is The Last Ghetto, an everyday history of Theresienstadt, which was published in 2020. Benjamin Het earned a JD at the University of Toronto and practiced litigation in Canada before earning a PhD in history at Harvard. He has taught at Harvard College and the Harvard Law School, and since 2003 at Hunter College and the Graduate Center, City University of New York. He is the author of several books, including The Death of Democracy, Hitler's Rise to Power and the Downfall of the Weimar Republic, The Nazi Menace, Hitler, Churchill, Roosevelt, Stalin, and the Road to War, Burning the Reichstag, and Crossing Hitler. Het has been the recipient of fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation and the American Council on Learned Societies. He is presently working on a project about Arthur Neby and the German criminal police during the Second World War. I will post a link to The Last Ghetto where you can purchase it. Thank you so much for being here today, and I will hand it off to our presenters.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Gabriel. Hello, everybody. Welcome. It's really a delight and an honor for me to have a chance to do this event with Anna. Let me just say at the outset, for people who haven't had a chance to look at Anna's book yet, I really recommend that you do so. It's an extraordinary book. There we go. It's a really extraordinary book. I often say that I think works of history should do at least one of two things. You know, one thing is they should put new information on the table based on original research. And the other thing a history book can do is give us a new insight, a new interpretation, a new angle on the thing that's being looked at. And Anna's book is in the really small category of books that do both and do both brilliantly. It's an extraordinary feat of research. We'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. But it's also just a brilliantly original book in terms of its insights, in terms of its analysis, its explanations. I found reading it, it's sort of every page is a bit of a revelation. So I'm really delighted to have this opportunity to talk to you, Anna, about it and to talk with everybody here. Let's start off with some just basic framing for people who might not be so familiar with this. Can you just tell us a little bit about what the ghetto of Terezín or Theresienstadt was, what it was, when, and why it was created?
Thank you so much, Ben, for this very generous introduction. I'm very delighted to have this conversation with you. We met each other during the pandemic, during the lockdown on social media. And you have really become a cherished intellectual partner and also somebody with who I go to discuss difficult things. So it's nice to talk with you about something not difficult, but something that is very important to me. And thanks to Gabriel and for Sydney for the invite and for the organization. So I will very briefly, in 2 points, share my screen. Here we go. And say this, Theresienstadt, it's good to have the hard data in front of us, was set up by the Nazis in November 1941. And it lasted until one day after the end of the war in Europe, until the 9th May 1945. And from the beginning on, when the Nazis set it up, it functioned as a transit ghetto. People came in and people were sent to annihilation camps and to ghettos in Nazi-occupied East. The ghetto was all of the town, Terezín, or in Czech, or Theresienstadt in German, and it was in the occupied Protectorate Bohemia and Moravia, just a little bit from the German border with the so-called Sudetengau. And what is interesting about the picture, which is something like 20 years old, is that the town pretty much survived as it is until today. A couple of buildings don't stand there anymore, and a couple of buildings have been built since. But you can see here that it is a fortress town that was built at the end of the 18th century by the Habsburgs to kind of protect against the Prussian army that never came. And until 1938, it was a military town with military, with sex workers, with something like 2,000 or 3,000 civilians. And then with the German occupation, when Eichmann and his team were deciding how to solve the Jewish question, they set their eyes on Theresienstadt first as a holding place, as a transit place for Central European Jews, only Czech, but later with different exception groups. Altogether, 144,000 people passed through Theresienstadt. Sorry, my cat is acting out. Sorry, this is a light moment in a series one. So altogether, 144,000 people passed through. Everybody who was marked by the Nazis as Jewish, they were racially Jewish. Whether they self-interpreted or self-identified as Jewish or not is a different question that we may come to that if you are interested. The biggest group were Czech Jews. Pretty much all of Czech Jews, unless they went into hiding, were protected by mixed marriages or were deported with the first few transports to Lodz or Minsk, were sent to Theresienstadt, and then later exception groups from Germany, Austria, the Netherlands, Slovakia, and Hungary. And because unlike most other ghettos, albeit not all, Theresienstadt survived until the end of the war, we have compared especially to places like Lodz or to Warsaw or to Białystok, in big quotation marks, a lot of survivors. This is a small fraction. Almost nobody survived. And the question, who is telling the story and should we focus on the survivors or not, is something that I want to reflect here. The next point I want to kind of look at is the self-administration and how to organize the place. And it's also the question of maps, because every map is not a history, it's always an interpretation. So one thing that I aimed to do for the book is to draw new maps. A lot of the maps that we know from the research to date are built on maps that were drawn by the Jewish cartographers in the ghetto. And my partner is an architect, and she wanted to participate in the book. So something that we did together was to spend a lot of time over old maps. We visited Terezín, we climbed on the fortification, and she drew the maps that you find in the book. But also, if you want to look up them in a bigger, in more detail, I created a website for the next 10 years on the lastghetto.org, where you can look it up in more detail, because one of the things that I aimed to write the book for is for the children and grandchildren and relatives of people who were imprisoned in Theresienstadt, that they get a sense about the last months and years of their relatives. So it's not only read by academics as an analytical history, but also as as a homage to the people who were senselessly killed here. And with the map, I already want to put on the next bit that I will stop sharing here, is that the story of the Jewish self-administration, because Theresienstadt, similarly to many other ghettos, the Nazis figure out very quickly that bureaucracy is a lot of work. So they outsource the administering, the organization to Jewish functionaries whom they forced to take over these jobs. And also the tenure of these people has changed over time. And eventually most of them were killed and sent to Auschwitz, as so-called Rücke unerwünscht, or so-called Weisung people who were shot upon arrival. but it is also a story to which I contribute. Should we talk about collaboration? Had these people any leeway? Should we take this leeway seriously? And so on. And I think this is the point where I will stop.
You've already listed a lot of the things that caused me to say this is such a brilliantly original book that is, in some ways the themes are very broad and broader even than just the subject of Theresienstadt, which is important enough. But just still on a preliminary question, one thing I would really like to ask you, because I'm always curious about this kind of thing. I'd like to ask you what drew you to this subject? What made you think of writing and researching about Theresienstadt? What's your sort of personal experience with this subject?
Mm-hmm. So the completely dry story is twofold. One is that when I was a young student in 1999, I think, I went to visit Israel for the first time at my paternal grandparents, who during the war were in communist resistance, and their group helped Jewish comrades to go into hiding. So the people whom they helped survive were communists who happened to be Jews, and they helped them falsify papers. Some of their friends, however, did not go into hiding, went with their families or friends to Theresienstadt. And if they're very lucky, they survived and immigrated to Israel. And as soon as 1989 came, this is kind of a well-known story by all historians of Czech Jewish history. Czech Jews kind of never gave up, and they came back in big groups, especially the Israelis. So I definitely saw how my grandmother, and to a lesser degree also my grandfather, by then they were no longer a couple, were surrounded by their friends. They also put first forward my grandmother and then grandfather as a righteous among the nations. So when in 1999, when I went to Israel, I went with a long list of telephone numbers, and these people are incredibly cordial and warm and helpful. By today, pretty much everybody has passed away, and back then they were in the late 60s and the early 70s, so they were retired, they had lots of time, but they were also completely fit. So they drove me around, and I was often at the backdrop of their conversations about how Terezín was like, and I did not really think much back then about concentration camps and ghettos, but I was really struck by this incredibly lively story of society under these most horrible of conditions that took place, about falling in love, about playing soccer, about learning other languages, about teasing each other, about the question, did we have toilet paper? Did we not have toilet paper? And I knew already then as a 20 or 19-year-old that this would be a wonderful case study of society in extremis. It's also a case study that I could do because I spoke the necessary languages. I spoke Dutch and Czech and German. And the Yiddish was not necessary because this is a story of very assimilated Central European and Western Jewry. That is one part of the story. But the other part of the story, and something that I only started coming to terms, or maybe I was willing to think about in the last 2 or 3 years once the book was finished, it's also the story of my maternal relatives who were Jewish and who were deported to Theresienstadt, and none of the people who were deported came back. The only people who survived was my maternal grandfather and his sister, who survived as so-called Michelin, and it's something that we will come back to. And in a way, it was a story in which my maternal relatives were incredibly interested, but they were also very, very afraid. And my late grandfather was incredibly interested in all of my research. He was, during his lifetime, before he retired, a TV director in the Czech TV. And after he retired, he did something like 60 interviews for the so-called Spielberg Foundation. And he really prepared really well. I often came across his interviews during my research. And he was so curious about my work. He also came to my talks. He was not the most patient of men, but he sometimes listened to me. And that was really important to me. And now that the book is finished, I also feel like I can allow myself to talk about it because I managed to close the project. And I think a lot of people who are listening today are aware how difficult it is to finish a book. And therefore I feel safer thinking about those topics.
That's incredibly powerful. I think your personal connection to the story, I think, is an important element of it. And I think it adds dimensions to the incredible research you've done. I want to come back to something you just referred to a moment ago. You made a couple of references to Theresienstadt society. And one of the, I think, really, to me, eye-opening points you make in the book is that we can't understand this as being outside of Europe and outside of history, in a sense. That the society that came to be in Theresienstadt was a European society and in extremis, certainly, but it had all the hallmarks in some ways of European societies. And you have incredibly nuanced analyses of sort of what made up that society, what the different groups were, what the sort of, subgroups were in the Terezín ghetto, and, what the sort of prestige level was, who had prestige, who had power, who didn't. So I wonder if you can say a little bit about that.
Mm-hmm. Well, if like sometimes I'm pushed, like, what is the central argument of my book? And I do not really like this question, because I think a book should offer then more than just one central argument. At least that's the book that I wanted to write, to be a bit sad, to kind of try to distill a book about death and dying and the Holocaust into one argument. But I guess one important argument that I show is the importance of class, and that class continues, that suffering and persecution doesn't make everybody equal. It's a question about which a lot of Jewish historians or historians of Jewish history and the Holocaust have thought a great deal. But at the same time, how did the social hierarchy really develop? Historians, whether it's Marin Kaplan or Dalia Offa, and others have looked at great lengths, and it is not only about access to food, it's not only about access to resources, it is not a top-down ladder, but it's a kind of a pyramid that grows into all kinds of directions. You could say that on the top you have the veterans, the younger Czech Jews, often men, who came with the first two transports, with the so-called construction detail, and on the bottom you will have elderly people from abroad, because at one point in May and June 42, it looks like that it was the Jewish self-administration that decided to solve the issue of lack of food with introduction of food categories, where the elderly who no longer have to work will receive the smallest food rations. But then you have a lot of other categories that make a huge influence on where you are situated on the kind of the social scale of Theresienstadt, on your seniority, when have you arrived? And here you see how really, and that is the old argument of Erwin Goffman, but also Terence Depre, the comparability of these places of imprisonment to classical history of prisons. So seniority, social capital, are you charming, are you good looking, can you learn languages quickly? Age is very important. So people above 65 are often treated as waste, and we find it in testimonies over and over, whether it's diaries or later post-war testimonies. It's also ethnicity, because due to the fact that it is the Czech Jews who are first deported to Theresienstadt, and then it's the other groups, even though the society in Theresienstadt is very much not a binary society, people employ some kind of a binary thinking between the Czechs and the foreign. And you have already touched on that. I am a native Czech, I'm Czech and British citizen today. And much of that for me was the striking moment to realize that Czech Republic was this kind of the epitome of a small country that is kind of cute. And whenever New York Times publishes something about the Czech Republic, it is kind of a comical Schweikian story. And sometimes it's a little bit frustrating, because Czech Republic has very serious problems. And I think some of the people who are attending today will be aware that 2 weeks ago, there was this horrible homophobic attack in the neighboring state of Bratislava that was not covered in the New York Times, because it's not a cute little story that you can spin in such a way. With that, you see how Czechs, who have always been tiny, are the dominant group in Theresienstadt. And then when you study the documents very closely, as I have spent a lot of time doing when I was thinking about the book and writing it, is how all of these factors start coming together. And you have, for example, all the people from Berlin who, thanks to their language skills and thanks to their great charisma, are able to make a little bit something like a social career in Theresienstadt. And these are often then the people who are lucky enough and survive. You have also certain correlation between how long are you able to stay in Theresienstadt and have good enough job so that you are exempted from the transports, because it is the Jewish self-administration whom the Nazi forced to set together the transport list, the actual names on the transport list. So if you are ranked as so-called indispensable, that will protect you. There are also other categories that protect people. And then it is, on the other hand, people who can have arrived on the first transports, but because they are not so popular, they will be maybe not put on such good jobs and will be sent to transports on. But then you have a lot of other things. And I guess my central point here is that even though Theresienstadt was set up to the Nazis, the society that emerged here was decisively not a Nazi creation. And it's a very much a place in European and Central European Jewish history. Mm-hmm. And it's also a Jewish history that is maybe a little bit counterintuitive, because it's not eminently Jewish or not Jewish in a way. And I already talked about ethnicity, and maybe there are people who are listening here and thinking, why is she talking about ethnicity? After all, ethnically, all of these people were Jewish. On top of that, they were ethnically Central European and Eastern European Jewish. So they kind of look like me and I guess you, Ben. They were all kind of tall or middle-sized. They were not particularly chubby because they were in Theresienstadt. They had light skin and light eyes and brown or blonde hair. And yet they constantly employ something that and a little bit of theory, I call ethnic gaze. Mm. And the Czech Jews describe, say, the Dutch Jews and the German Jews and the Danish Jews as different, and as Jewish in a different way, or as Jewish because they're not Jewish enough. And the same applies to the Czech Jews. And my conclusion here is that any society will create and engender ethnic differences, and these will be linked to class.
I found that actually particularly fascinating, the what you call the ethnic gaze, the ways in which the different groups, especially mostly the Czechs and the Germans and the Dutch, would sort of characterize each other in these very sort of nationally loaded terms. But which leads to something else I wanted to ask you about it, and sort of coming back to what you're saying about how Theresienstadt is very much a Jewish creation, even though it's part of Nazi oppression of European Jews. But you refer, running through the book, you talk a lot about what you call the master narrative of Theresienstadt. And I wonder if you could just say a little bit about what that is.
Mm-hmm. So the master narrative may be something that those of you who have visited Terezín or went to Prague and visited the Pinka synagogue with the very impressive memorial for the Czech Jewish victims is something how we kind of best know Terezín. It's a master narrative in which Terezín is told as a site where Jews, persecuted, banished from their homes, and marked as pariahs, proved that they could salvage something good out of something bad. And the Terezín master narrative maintained that Jews demonstrated that they could excel at manual labor, the very people who were like, always the lawyer and the architect, the white-collar jobs, take care of the most vulnerable, who were defined as children, and produce outstanding cultural events. And this mass narrative then produced corresponding memories. So it kind of feeds into the sources that we then have. And the mass narrative is not wrong. It's part of the story, but it's not the whole history. And that's something then that very much informed my research in the how to in the archives.
Okay. And another theme that runs really through the book in all kinds of ways, again, in your really, I think, nuanced analyses of how status and power work, is themes or are themes of gender and sexuality. Can you say a little bit about how gender and sexuality inform as sort of theoretical lenses your interpretation of Theresienstadt?
Mm-hmm. Well, the kind of classical gender history tells us that gender is really everywhere, and it often influences or codes how we understand things as meaningful, as right, or as wrong. I mean, that is the kind of basis of Joe Scott and the other classic line of gender historians. And I also was a little bit I guess, irritated with some of the histories of ghettos that were coming out when I was thinking about writing this PhD on which the book is based, that would set aside a little chapter, say, about marriage, divorce, and abortion and sex work in the ghetto, as if this is gender and we have dealt with it and now we can go to the normal history, because gender is everywhere. You can see it on the examples of the Czech boys going out with the foreign girls. How do they decide who are they going to introduce to their friends and to their parents? And who is the girl with whom they will be sexually active, but they will maybe not walk her home in the morning? How are the women negotiated with whom they start dating? They are expected to learn Czech, and they're expected to basically become part of the Czech group. You see it also on the coding of the famous Theresienstadt culturally life, about which I write a lot in detail. We have all heard about Requiem and about the Battered Bride, and the Battered Bride, Smetana's opera, which is put on the first time, I think, in October 42 in Terezín, and people go to see Smetana, they cry, and they say, this is the first moment when I feel as human. And then at one point, one of the conductors puts into Mařenka, into the role of the main female protagonist who sings the famous aria Proč bychom se netěšili, a woman whose first language is not Czech. And I show a couple of examples, how it's this woman with Sudetengerman background, is Faklinke, and other people, and suddenly she's described as not beautiful, as an old hag, as a Mařenka who needs to be beautiful and nubile and pretty and young, and this woman is not, and also she sings with a German accent. And you see how the femininity is coded in incredibly ethnic ways. And when you kind of look at it logically, you can start pushing back. And my point is not to say how well these women sang or not, and how, whether you're allowed to sing when you're one day over 45, because then you will also find a number of singers who were female and who were Czech and sang above the age of 45 and were not criticized as such. But it is often gender that is used to criticize someone for breaking certain rules. So we should pay attention to these gendered and particularly salient sexualized narratives of the appropriate, not appropriate. I guess before I published the book, my academic claim to fame was my work on sex work and the Holocaust. And it is often women who engage in sexual barter in order to provide for their families. And then they are shamed, or they in the ghetto for doing something that they ought not to do, while their relatives take the food that they thus earned. And after the war, if these women were extremely lucky, and for Theresienstadt, I have mostly examples of heterosexual sexual barter where women barter sex. Since then, I've come across other stories, and it is somehow, I have to say, as a feminist, we need to actually ask the question: what are the stories that are not told, and should we take these judgments on board, or should we show them for what they are? And that is also the role of the historian, to show understanding where this pushback came back, but also show for that this is a judgment, this is not part of history.
Yeah, I think you said in the book, and correct me if I'm remembering this incorrectly, I think you said that men did not engage in sexual barter in Terezín. Is that right? I have the good fortune of being invited the second time to the Museum of Jewish Heritage. And the first time I spoke here, I was on trans histories of Nazi Germany Holocaust. And that was for me a welcome invite to think also about my own, in Germany we say Scheuklappen, like a horse who only looks into what the horse knows. And I thought more about the Danish clown Hambo, who was a Berlin emigre, who was a clown, and who was a female impersonator. And it was a good chance to actually read them transly, read them queerly, and not necessarily as a gay man who is a female impersonator, but as a trans figure. And one of the things that we have as a source about Hambo is a friend, and also a very gossiping friend, another queer person, a gay man, Ralph Oppenheim, who kept a diary in Theresienstadt, who was accepted as a gay man, but also whose partner was not with him in Theresienstadt. And Oppenheim wrote once or twice about Hambo that Hambo made ends meet
by offering sexual services. I already said that in the talk before, because there was a very kind journalist who came and wrote it up and published a bit about Hambo and sex work as a fact. And I want to mark it up that it is a potentially problematic source. And you know as well as me that these are stories that can be very easily taken out of context. So I try to be maybe a little bit too academic and too careful. But that would be one such story. I have also recently published an article about prostitution at the Holocaust, where I look at more examples, but they are not necessarily in Theresienstadt. I'm sure if people would dig deeper, they would find such stories. And in fact, I would be delighted if people kind of looked at my book and took it as a point of departure for further studies, because I've spent a lot of time researching this book, but there's also a lot of moments when one needs to say, and now I finish here because there is only so much I can cover in this chapter. And it's a little bit like being a Japanese gardener with a bonsai, where you decide how deep will you dig and when will the reader just get confused.
I sometimes like to think of a historian who had a big impact on me when I was just starting off as A.J.P. Taylor, who repeatedly said something like, perfection is sterile, error is always fertile, and perhaps the same could be said. There is a point where you have to stop your research. Sooner or later, you have to put it out there, and there always is more to tell. But then, that leads into something else I wanted to ask you about, which is, by any mortal standard, I think the scale of research you've done for this book is absolutely extraordinary. I flipped through you have at the back of the archives you consulted, and I thought, oh my goodness, how did she ever do this? It really is something else, and a long list of interviews that you did, and in some cases interviews that you've made use of that other people did. It's just a really extraordinary empirical base. So I wonder if you could say a little bit just about the sort of process of researching this and what your experiences were in sort of digging through all these materials.
Yeah. I was hoping you would answer that question, because it also leads to the question of what did I expect to find in the archives and what was a surprise. And I thought a lot about that, because of course, and that is the point that Alexander Garbarini calls the epistemological gap, how basically we live in something and we stop what surprised us. And that is for me, having finished the book and having had the good fortune to think about it and talk about it a lot. And I want to share first a little bit about the methodology, and then a little bit to go back to the shocking moment. I'm a big believer in the inductive method. That means I wanted to be led by the sources to the conclusions I draw. I didn't want to come to the material with a certain theory and then stuff the sources into it so that, like, it's like a dead goose that cannot be tested. So I really looked at it all. I made a list early on in the dissertation of all the archives that I knew had relevant collections about Theresienstadt, and then I visited them all. I didn't go to Australia. I have never been to Australia yet. Maybe somebody will invite me now that the pandemic is over, but otherwise I really spent 2.5 years on the road, and I lived from the suitcase, and I went to Israel for 6 months and to the Czech Republic for something like 6 months, and to New York for 2 or 3 months, and to London for 2 months. And it was wonderful and very exciting, and also very lonely, because I would make new friends. And then had to move to a different city and made new friends. And it was also often very hard to sit in the archives, and something like 95% or 90% of the sources I read were self-testimonies, were diaries, letters, drawings, memoirs, autobiographies, all histories. You said I interviewed people. I did not actually interview so many people. I largely built on all history collections around the world in a number of languages. I read a lot of diaries, and often these testimonies are just heartbreaking. And I remember there was a whole moment for me in Yad Vashem where basically my method would be like to pull up the next document, read it, type up the notes, close it, and get to the next one. And also take photographs, because that really made my life so much easier, that I could take photographs. And I would read in practice, it looked like I would read the document, I would start crying. I cried, I quieted down, I dried my eyes, I tapped up the notes, I put it away. And then I take the next thing, and it is again heartbreaking in a completely different way. And it is in a really banal way also very exhausting. And I would come home and be completely exhausted. And one thing that I thought about a lot back then, and it's something that I take very seriously, is that I see my work, which I'm very passionate about. And I'm also very proud of it. And I do not think Holocaust history is like any other history, but I insist on the fact that it's my work and it's not my whole life. And I also insist that people who ask me for help respect it and treat me nicely, because that does not always happen to historians. And it's something that you and I, Ben, have been talking about quite a lot. So I insist on usually stopping to work at 7 p.m. And I really try hard not to work on the weekends. And in 2015, when I met the woman who is my partner, who is my wife, I was delighted that she's an architect and she's not an academic, she's not a historian. And my take is that she's not terribly interested in my work. She would disagree. She would say that she's very interested in my work. But it is also very refreshing to have a partner who comes home and is full of her work about social architecture and building and the stress in the office. And she will tell me, now it's Anna, it's done, and I do not want to hear these stories. And maybe you have 5 minutes. And it also teaches me to take it all and close it. And I try, and sometimes I fail, not to tell funny stories from Theresienstadt to the Holocaust at dinner parties, because to me, they're fascinating. And I forget that they are actually absolutely horrifying to people and that they come to parties to have fun. And of course, like my level of what is fascinating and what is heartbreaking, like to you, Ben, has shifted. But one story has never lost its rawness. And that was back to Yad Vashem, when I was looking at the collection of the petitions to be taken out of transport, because since it was the Jewish self-administration that put together the actual transports, people could also apply to be exempt to petition. And when I came across the list of petitions, there's, I think, something 10,000 of them. I write a big chunk of the 6th chapter on transports about those, because I did a bit of a quantitative analysis, building on the work of people like Eugene Finkel, or especially Andreas Kranebitter, because Zhenya has not published his book back then, with the help of my father, who is a sociologist. And I remember in actually one of the first file that I came across this this petition, and I read it. It's in German, and it's a guy called Wilhelm Kraus, who is applying to be exempt in September 43. And in the second paragraph, he mentions that he has a wife who died in August 42, who is an Aryan and Czech. And he has 2 children out of that marriage, a daughter who is 15 and a boy who's 19. And I realize it's all terribly familiar, and that the man writing the petition is my great-grandfather, who will not be successful. He was not successful. He was sent to Auschwitz. He was sent to the family camp. And of course, the people from the September 43 transport were all, if they were still alive, killed in the gas chambers in March 44. And it's a whole package of feelings, not all positive. And I guess looking back, it's still the moment that this, you see, is absolute dynamite. I guess this is the first time I talk about it publicly. But I also wanted to do it in a moment when I do it with someone who I like and who I respect and with who I feel safe. And I also, looking back, feel really glad that back then my grandfather was still alive, that I could share it with him. His German was excellent. He was bilingual. And it was incredibly meaningful to him. Because you see, we had so little from great-grandfather after he was sent to Auschwitz. We had, I think, 1 or 2 postcards, and then we had 1 more postcard from Auschwitz. But this is a very eloquent and beautifully written letter by a guy who is trying to fight. And I have looked at, 10,000 of these petitions, and I got a sense of like who will be the people who will be successful and who will not be successful. It's also a lot of good chance. And he was not. I do not, of course, not know why, but to have the document means a lot. If you ask me what it means, I would not know. But I guess that is the thing about the Holocaust, that it will always leave these things that will relate to you or to someone who you know and who you love, and will not let you go. And I guess this is also why I was always interested in the victim history of the Holocaust and not in the perpetrators. So I wanted to share that.
Well, that's incredibly powerful, Anna. Thank you for sharing that. Certainly, for me, it's a familiar thing to have that reaction. There's a particular document, I think maybe you and I have talked about it. There's a document that I came across in some work written by a young German Jewish woman who's about to be deported to Auschwitz. And I found the original letter that she wrote to somebody in America when I was doing some work, and held that letter in my hands. And I still can't read it. I found it about 25 years ago. I still can't read that letter without choking up. And so I think those of us who work on this stuff, the power of the awfulness of some of these things is really emotionally often difficult. Well, unfortunately, maybe that segues into something I wanted to ask you about. So, you've referred to the fact that Theresienstadt was a transport camp in part, which basically means it was a place where people were sent as in many cases, a way station to being sent further to a destination where they were going to be murdered in the Nazi genocide. And most of the people who were sent on from Theresienstadt were sent to Auschwitz. And so, as you said, I think your sort of last sort of main chapter in the book is on transports, and it's incredibly heartbreaking in a million different ways. And there's a lot we could talk about, but I wanted to pick another of these really, I think, powerful stories that sort of haunts me from your book. And that's the story of a guy named Luděk Eckstein. Can you tell a little bit about his experience with the whole issue of transport?
Yeah, it's also my favorite story. Luděk Eckstein, after the war, Eliáš was a young actor. He was a member of the communist group, and in May 1944, he was put on transport to Auschwitz. And there's this whole situation where his girlfriend is supposed to be sent to Auschwitz, so he volunteers to go with her. Then she's exempt by the communist group, so he needs to kind of get out too. And then his brother is put on transport, so now he's in the position, should he stay with the girlfriend in Terezín, or should he go with the brother? And the brother is younger and is a bit sickly, so the parents expect him to go. And he has a dilemma. And this is the moment when he goes to a mentor and a friend, Gustav Schorsch, who, unlike him, did not survive. And he's this kind of wise guy. And I have a quote. He looked into the distance, just like he always did. He told me a sentence which I shall not forget to my death. Once in one's life, you get into a situation in which you yourself have to find a solution. And this situation will show you who you actually are. He gave me his hand and left. And I went voluntarily to Auschwitz. Says Eckstein, and it's a beautiful moment. It's a moment also very heavy in morality, because he says there is something good to be gleaned out of this horrible situation. And I thought a lot what is happening here. I mean, you have a couple of layers. One is we have been thinking since, pretty much since Hannah Arendt and the totalitarianism argument, what do concentration camps and ghettos do to people? Or you could go with Lawrence Langer and his famous argument on choiceless choices. Did people have a meaningful choice? And here you have somebody who stresses that there was a meaningful choice and there was a moral choice. And it was a moment that you could see if a man is good or bad, what is their backbone. And that is not the whole story. That is also the story of that this is such a destructive moment that is very much marked by powerlessness. And as Doris Bergen, who was the supervisor of the PhD on which the book is based, has shown in her work, this powerlessness often drives survivors to overstress their own agency. And then they go, and we know from Hayden White and others, people in narrativity, how basically people narrating these fragmented and disorienting moments look for narrative frameworks, for literary frameworks. For the Holocaust, it's most frequently tragedy, but it doesn't have to be. I mean, Art Spiegelman's Mouse is not a tragedy. And he goes for the framework of morality, and that helps him to be in charge. And because he's an actor, and unfortunately that clip doesn't exist with English subtitles, but he acts the moment very, very powerfully. It acts it that even you reading it also go for kind of the first layer, which is this very, very courageous man who gleans this moral lesson. But the transports often broke people, and I would be careful judging and kind of going for the morality level, because we have seen over the last 6 and 7 years since Trump was elected, and the world has been shifting through some very, very tough choices. And of course, we want to support Ukraine, at least I and you want to support Ukraine, but it also means that a lot of things are much more expensive, and that the oil and gas is much more expensive, and people who are not middle class professors will need to make very tough calls about what to bring on the table and how to heat in the winter. And I would be very careful about judging them. And that also kind of brings the last story, who is telling these stories, and largely it is the survivors. And I did want to bring the story of Wilhelm Krauss, my great-grandfather, who I never met. My mother grew up without grandparents, as that the majority did not come back. There is this famous book by Bode, I Did Not Interview the Dead. And when I finished the book, I knew there can be only one dedication to those who did not come back.
So actually, in a way, thinking of who tells the story, the way you end the book, I think, is particularly beautiful and beautifully written. And I should have thought to have it directly in front of me, but I didn't. But basically, you say something like, we need to think about the stories that haven't been told. And I found that beautiful and moving. And it's also difficult to think about. Can you tell us a little bit of how, as a historian, you think about, how do I do that? How do I tell the stories that haven't been told?
Yeah, I think about, you get a sense looking at the quotidian, and we follow here Marian Kaplan and her beautiful Between Dignity and Despair, where she says the quotidian will continue, the children still need to go to school, somebody needs to peel the onion, and so on. But you will see here lots of changes. So if you want to understand the society in extremis, history of everyday life is incredibly meaningful. And that will give you a sense of things that happened, but that they are not told. So why do we have so few testimonies of people who gave up their children at selection, and they figured out what it would mean, and they gave up the children and they survive? You can cross-check who goes to Auschwitz with a baby or with a 5-year-old and who survives. And of course, you will have some accidents, but not so many. Why? Because it is socially unacceptable to give up your baby. Society expects you that the parent will be killed with their child. And the point here is not that I want to say it's a great idea to give up your kid. I say it as a childless person. I say it, we need to historicize the stigma and question where it's coming from. The same then can apply to people selling sex to make ends meet to support their families. And most people about whom I was able to ascertain that they participate in sexual barter in Theresienstadt, in selling, they do it to support their families. And they have been completely shamed into silence. Or what about the mixed marriages that fell apart under pressure, and the Gentile partner, the non-Jewish partner, divorced their Jewish partner? They knew at some point full well after, November, December 41, that it will mean that their partners will be sent to Theresienstadt. And you see over and over in the surviving Czech offspring of these marriages that fell apart, is that they said that the parents did so to protect them. But Benjamin Frommer and myself and others have had a good, sober look at what happened to the so-called Mischlinge, and there was precious little impact on whether the parents were still married or not. It had some impact on the belongings, and a lot of non-Jewish partners did not divorce them, and that also raises some tough questions of, will you be there for your partner when things get really rough? And of course, there are thousands of mixed marriages that do not fall apart. And I think I guess the most important function of these hard histories, and these are the hard histories, is to ask us about suitable history, and are we ready for the things that have been swept under the carpet, because it shows us people in all of their ambivalence, not necessarily bad people, but people as humans. And to humanize them and to show the victims in all of their ambivalence is something that the Nazis sought to erase, and to give them their humanity back. And the wards and all, and the cute children who drew the drawings that we today have in the Pinka synagogue, and the divorced partners who were in Theresienstadt and hope they will make it and will remarry, and some of them actually did. And people who stole from their friends, and people who played soccer, and people who flirted and married after the war, and Ludwig Eckstein, who survived and met his sweetheart, and they married and lived happily ever after in Ostrava. That all is part of the Holocaust, and that part all is kind of this part of this bigger history. And I think we need to be brave enough to face it.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, that's a sample of the kind of wisdom that you get when you read Anna's fantastic work. I think, Gabriel, I think this is maybe the moment where we should turn to the audience for questions.
Absolutely. And thank you so much, Anna and Ben, for such a interesting, compelling conversation. I know we had a lot of wonderful comments in the chat, and a few questions came through, so I will start with those. If you do have other questions, please post them and we'll try to answer them. Someone had asked if that they visited Theresienstadt and was interested in knowing, and I wonder if you know this, how the townspeople interacted with the Nazis and the prisoners there.
So when Terezín is set up in November 41, the prisoners are first sent to 102 barracks, and bit by bit, the civilians are kind of cleared from one bit after another. And then in June 42, everybody from the non-Jews are forced to move into the surrounding, into the protectorate, and all of the town becomes Jewish. So there was precious little interactions. There is a story to be written, I touch on it very briefly, about the non-Jewish gendarmes who did the guarding of the ghetto from the outside, and then also some of the stories for the smuggling. I believe Benjamin Frommer is writing on a book about the persecution of Jews in the protectorate and the kind of the road to Terezín, the so-called ghetto without walls. It will be a difficult history because it is a story that is often told as one of help and support. And then when you look at the sources, gendarmes did not necessarily help altruistically. It also raises the question, is our expectation of altruism not one that has nothing to do with history? But also we have the post-war trials when the surviving Jews pressed charges for so-called collaboration against the gendarmes who were anti-Semitic and who made their life living hell, and who coerced them into handing over a lot of jewels. So this is one of the bits where I would like someone to look at the maybe 3 or 4 paragraphs that I write about that, not necessarily because I did not think it is not interesting, but it is not part of the Jewish history of the Theresienstadt that I wanted to write, and take it as a point of departure. I also hope that Benjamin Frommer will finish his book soon.
Thank you. We had 2 questions, so I'll tie them into one about, and you'll help me, Leo Bayek, is that correct?
Leo Beck.
Leo Beck. So he, the questions are, 1, what, if any, effect did he, as the former chief rabbi of Germany, have in the camp? And do you know about his incarceration?
Yes, this is a wonderful question. And Ben and I were debating whether we should have a Beck question, but then we decided to go less nerdy. So I'm happy to have a nice question about Leo Beck. I have strong feelings about the research on Leo Beck, as I have made it very plain on social media. I have a subchapter on Leo Beck, so do get my book, do check it out. The book is not expensive, something like $30. He did have an enormous symbolic capital, and he was quite a skilled person in operating this very ambivalent sphere. And he was able to uphold his high cultural capital in Ghetto 2. He also was one of the extremely few people in Terezín who actually had a servant who, the servant And I think, Gabriel, you did not mention that I have COVID. So now I'm actually I'm sick from COVID. And one of the things that always happens to me when I have COVID, my brain fog is even worse and I blank out on names. And that is very frustrating because I have written about this woman, that I've researched her deeply, that I looked up her reparation file. So her first name is Dora. And it is much easier to be a high-flying and influential rabbi who shares words of wisdom when you have someone who will wash your clothes in the cold water, will cook your food, will take care of things, and also he has somewhat better accommodation. He also meets people who have escaped from Auschwitz and decides not to share the news for all kinds of reasons. I've been a little bit frustrated that after my book came out, a colleague who is well-known and a very senior historian of Jewish history has published a book on Leo Baeck. And even though I have published on Leo Baeck well before my book came out and have covered these news, he doesn't cite my work, which I find irritating and uncollegial.